Welcome to the a16z podcast. I'm Michael Copeland, and we have here today with us Kurt McMaster, CEO and co-founder of Cyanogen. Kurt, welcome.
Hey, good to see you.
And from a16z, Al Villamoria.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. So we're here today to talk about mobile and the potential for a third mobile OS. And we've been chasing this for a long time, and the sort of main players have shifted over the years. But now things seem fairly locked into the Android, iOS, state of being. But that said, I want to sort of set the tone then and get your opinions then, and maybe we can start with you, Kurt, on who benefits from a third mobile OS, and why is it something that we should all be caring about?
Well, I think the assumption is such that all of the innovation that can occur in mobile computing has occurred with Apple and Google leading the charge, right? Nobody else is creating an OS, only Apple and Google.
Right.
In China, everybody's making iterative versions of Android in some ways. There's a few others that are trying. They're doing a really bad job at doing so. But at the end of the day, we think there's a lot more innovation to occur in mobile computing, right? And we think that as mobile computing goes from a couple of billion users to well over 6 billion users, there's an opportunity on the global platform for definitely a third, maybe even a fourth.
Right. Well, but let's talk about that. I mean, Apple just came off a record-setting quarter. They sold 75 million phones. Clearly, people love their devices and the OS running therein. Android is cranking up all over the world. Windows is doing its thing, and Nokia's helping them out. There's Tizen from Samsung. Consumers, they seem happy. What are they missing out on? And then on the flip side, what is the industry missing out on, or worried about missing out on, I should say?
I think that fundamentally, iOS and Google-driven Android are shells for their services, right? And everybody else can exist as an application, which means the level of innovation that occurs for services and core services that can take advantage of things at the low level on the device, kernel, etc. The kinds of APIs and SDKs that are only revealed by Apple to themselves to create interoperability between these services is absent from that of other services, right? And I'm not talking about games. I'm talking about core services that people should be able to use every day, things that should intimately be more integrated with the OS. And that's something that's missing today.
It's interesting, right? Because you start seeing this whole idea of the open systems versus closed systems, and Apple is doing extremely well globally, and it's doing it's basically unseated Samsung in China, and then you see Xiaomi coming in at the low end, Apple taking the high end, Xiaomi taking the low end, and that's also a relatively closed system in the sense of they build their own hardware, they've got their own software, they've got their MIUI operating system, they've got their own set of developers in China, kind of building apps for that up market. And it's kind of interesting to kind of see how these closed systems are actually kind of accelerating versus some of these other companies that are kind of trying to figure out, should I be building my own operating system? I mean, Nokia, BlackBerry, Samsung, really, they should probably not be building any software because they're really good at hardware.
Right. Well, again, I think that when you look at anybody else that's attempting to create an OS, number one, they're doing a bad job. Number two, they're nothing more than closed systems. There's no innovation there in how they actually tend to evolve what mobile computing is today, and that's something that we're very passionate about. Is what does an open computing platform actually look like? And I don't even want to mention the word mobile now because it all ties into that, right? So what does an open computing platform look like? And not only does it start with smartphones, it extends to wearables and things thereafter. If you look at Android Wear today, that is incredibly closed. There is no open source component to Android Wear whatsoever, right?
Right.
So in our mind, an open computing platform starts with smartphones, extends to wearables and IoT and everything else. And I think that what will arise from that is going to lead to sort of a next generation in mobile computing and the kinds of interaction models and use cases that people have yet to see, right?
Describe for us what that open computing platform starts to look like from a consumer perspective and then also from a developer point of view.
So as a brief example on the developer side, I think that there's a class of startup in the Valley focused on machine learning and AI. There's a number of different startups that have attempted to do what Google Now does, et cetera. But these kinds of services can't really exist as applications. They don't get any traction. Anything that requires machine learning and AI requires massive user bases to start to build out their data sets so that they get all the more powerful, et cetera. So what happens is you have these great minds coming together to create some really interesting technologies that don't have access to the core platform that can allow them to scale to the point where they actually become meaningful, right? And when they're locked out of that core system, they just really have no hope to thrive. I think that what's on the mind of a lot of these guys, these startup entrepreneurs that are creating these kind of companies, is such that, hey, maybe we'll create some great technology, get enough traction to prove the use case, and then hopefully Google or Apple will buy us so that they can integrate us into Siri or our own machine learning capabilities, et cetera. And we believe that within the open computing platform, these kind of companies can actually survive as standalone entities, right? Instead of just being an application, you can actually be a core service for the OS, and you can build a company and a business around that and provide your own SDKs and APIs linked into open platforms so that you're providing value to everything else that is deeply integrated into that system.
Yeah, it's basically just like, apps today, software companies today, just basically get to like sit on top of Android and maybe potentially have a little bit of enhanced functionality and features and kind of really be able to kind of showcase their product in a very kind of narrow way, because they can't plug in to kind of the root of the operating system. And so for a good example is like on iPhone, right? You can actually have the Twitter OAuth, and you can actually sign into Twitter at the settings level. And then you can actually have apps kind of be like, oh, okay, well, you can integrate your app with Twitter sign-in, Twitter login, right? And but that's still kind of relatively minor. It's just a login system. I think to Kurt's point, there's so many different services and elements within the operating system that could make software that much more compelling if a third mobile operating system was able to kind of open the doors to developers for all kinds of new innovation that was not possible with the two major vanguards today.
And that open computing platform that you're talking about, I mean, I get to really get in there and muck around and have access to everything and anything that I would like as a developer. And then as a consumer, what do I get?
There's a reason.
Potentially, once the developers do their magic, right?
Well, listen, there's a reason that Facebook tried to do a phone and Amazon tried to do a phone, because they all recognize how they're locked out, right, in the existing, incumbent mobile OS plays. So if you were to sit down with any product manager at Facebook or Spotify or Amazon, all of these guys would have incredible ideas in regard to how their services should be core services and how they could be fully integrated into the entire stack, not just sitting on top and acting as an application, right?
Right.
So there's a significant amount of use cases, and I think a lot of people can come up with them. And I don't want to ream off a whole bunch of different ones, but at the end of the day, there is no question that once you have this deeper level access and access to an open framework that enables complementary experiences to more effectively communicate with one another, you see a new class of experience arise. And I think that's what will begin to manifest on these platforms. And that's ultimately what's going to allow people's creativity to blossom as well. It's like now we can do things that previously were impossible to do.
Right.
Right.
That maybe only Apple can do within its own ecosystem.
Right. And look at Google now, right? They just announced that they've opened up their platform to about 20, 30 new partners, right?
Example.
And they're providing cards. Google now provides basically cards, right? So you can extend cards way out beyond, into other different use cases and scenarios whereby you have those interactions and that data being served in a meaningful way to the user. But the only way that Google now is really effective as a platform is such that it has the core system access, and it has access to all of the users of the platform, right? So it becomes all the more intelligent, which it creates that value, not only for Google, but the partners that they allow to integrate over time.
Right. And that's a huge advantage, you could argue an unfair advantage, I suppose.
Right. Allow to integrate. Right now they've expanded from 5 to 40. It's still 40. How many apps are there in the Android App Store today? 1.4 million?
Right. Let's talk about where Cyanogen fits in all this, and just give us a sort of a high-level state of the state for Cyanogen and how you guys operate within this open computing world.
this is key to what we believe is creating a more open mobile computing platform whereby developers can realize the full potential of what their product can be instead of existing as a sandbox standalone application, right? And creating that platform and the APIs, et cetera, to bring all of this together. Our roots were the community and the personalization and the openness, right? So we created an OS by the people that use the OS in many ways, right? That's how we modified and started adding features to Android, et cetera. Extending that further is how can we begin to evolve the OS based on what developers want to do. Not just giving them an SDK so they can be an application, but saying you have the whole canvas, right? Mm-hmm. Now what can you become? And that's what we want to do. So it's not only about creating an OS that's evolved with the users, in tangent with the users as it currently exists within our open source community, but extending it further to the development community, right? And then I really believe that will have a significant impact on a mass market consumer. I'd like to think that at some point in time over the next 12 to 18 months, you'll start to see experiences arise within the Cyanogen world that just do not exist within the iOS or the Android world.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like even from a location perspective, like we think of the American U.S. The model around Android is everyone's on Google, everyone's using all the various services that Google offers, Maps, YouTube, Gmail, you name it. But if you think about like China or India or Russia, there's so many other different types of apps and services that are considered the leaders or the better products in those specific regions. And there's no way to kind of have that deeper level of integration with those apps and services with Google's Android versus having kind of more. I mean, with Kurt, we talk about this all the time. There's all these countries that have these great apps that don't have that level of integration.
So this is an interesting story. And from Cyanogen's perspective, is this more a story, at least for the moment, that's outside the U.S. as opposed to inside the U.S.?
Listen, we think that mobile-first countries, i.e., people whose first computing device is a mobile device, over time, like in a very short period of time, I'd say within 12 to 18 months of using that computing device, are doing things with those devices that nobody in mature markets would do because we have the luxury of having PCs, tablets, and multiple computing devices, PlayStations and Xboxes, etc.
Right.
This is their only computing device.
Right.
So if you look at what's happened in China, there are many examples of how China is significantly more advanced with mobile products and services than in the U.S. and mature markets. So I think it's an unfair distinction that people often make that working in India or any of these emerging markets that you're somehow creating a dumbed down product. No, right. I find that these products, in fact, are more advanced and evolved. And I like to think that things that come out of India and Indonesia and Brazil, et cetera, are going to impact mature markets in a significant way, right?
So that's my question then. It sounds to me like that evolution is happening faster and kind of more prominently in places other than the U.S. where, like you say, we have all these other computing options.
And we have a much faster acceleration of just volume shipments that are going to happen over the next 5 years. I mean, we've got about 2.2 billion smartphones in the world today. Mm-hmm. The next 5 billion, like a vast majority, are going to come into countries that, China, India, Russia, Brazil, the ones that Kurt mentioned. That's where the innovation is going to happen. That's where the shipments are going to happen.
And it's not only where the innovation is happening, it's where the commoditization of hardware is happening, mm-hmm. which means we're seeing the rise of these new local kings around the world, these new OEMs like Micromax. Last August, they surpassed Samsung as volume shipment sales in India. Last week, they passed Samsung as the number one smartphone manufacturer in India, right? They're now a top 10 global OEM, right? Going to 9. Xiaomi's now at number 3. We're going to see more of these guys.
And how much is Micromax's flagship model?
Yeah, $140. But it's a $140 octa-core LTE device, the cheapest of its kind on the planet Earth. What's amazing is when we launched our first device, the One Plus, that thing was $299. Price performance, the best Android device in the world. That device at $299 was as good as any iPhone selling at $600. Now we have a $140 octa-core LTE device, right? The optimizations that we do on the kernel side make that device perform like the One Plus, et cetera. So you're getting to the point now where you have $140 devices that for all intents and purposes to an average person, right, not somebody living in the valley that's going to scrape over every feature and frame rate, etc. For the average person, it's as good as a freaking iPhone, right? That's significant, which means emerging markets are going to lead to the decimation of tier one OEMs because the Samsungs, etc., will not be able to compete at that level. If you look at Clay Christensen, I mean, the whole theory of disruption is that disruption always comes from the low end, not the high end.
Right.
And it's the guys on the high end that are incapable of innovating at the low end, right? So we're going to see some radical transformation.
It's
in the
also
next 5 years.
a shift from hardware to software, clearly, right? And
How do you mean?
well, I mean,
Because of the commoditization, you mean?
yeah, and because hardware has gotten so good, and I know that
So
faster
I
chips, et
agree.
cetera,
So
but-
what I see where you're going here, right? So hardware is becoming commoditized. In many ways, hardware has always been commoditized, right? I mean, Apple products are not that much better. They've just figured out a way to charge that much more than everyone else and make a better margin on these products,
Right.
right? And the Apple products are so good. Why? Really, it comes down to one thing: everyone else is so bad. That's why, right? It's not rocket science,
Right.
So once there's a few more guys that are at parity or even a little bit better incrementally, I believe over time Apple's even going to have problems because they're not going to be able to sustain these margins. And in these markets where Android is dominant, Apple's market share will be negligible. Right. As these markets continue to grow, as these markets begin to impact the rest of the world, then I think you're going to see Apple under increasing pressure within the next 5 to 10 years.
Apple's not going to be able to get these people who have never had a phone before in these emerging markets. This is not only going to be their first phone, this is going to be their first computer that they've ever interacted with. And at $140, and they're going to have a stellar experience versus before when they bought a $100 phone maybe 5 years ago, you could tell it was a $100 phone.
Right.
It felt different from
Exactly.
maybe the leading Android or leading iPhone at the time.
So make no mistake, there's $50 Android devices out there, and we're looking at some different
Sure.
scenarios there, and you can tell they're cheap phones. But next year, there's going to be $50 and $75 phones that are just as good, almost as good as an iPhone.
right, and the distinguishing characteristic will then be the software that's running inside of it, right?
Absolutely, it will be the software, right? And if you can take that device that's $75 and have experiences that don't even exist on a $600 iPhone, people are going to go for that device.
So is that the key?
Particularly when we can optimize for local geos. Apple's not doing anything to optimize for local geos.
What does that mean?
That means integration of services for local geos, whether it's messaging. It's like Zal pointed to, previously. Google Mobile Services, although everybody thinks of the Holy Grail, I mean, Google makes some great services, don't get me wrong. It's our intention as a company to always work with Google, and I use Google services. We love Google services, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of geos where certain mapping products are the dominant, right?
Right.
BBM is dominant in Indonesia, for God's sake. So in these markets, there will be multiple permutations of what a Google mobile service stack looks like in the US, right? And neither Google or Apple are really doing anything to embrace these other than the fact that they offer the App Store and the people the ability to download these applications. We're going to be optimizing for these local geos with all of these different partners, right? So we'll have different kinds of stacks that work in different geos that might not work in others.
Yep.
Give me some evidence that a third Mobile S is sort of ripe for now. I mean, and the reason I ask that is because clearly Microsoft has spent a lot of money to try and get there. Nokia ruled the roost forever and has
You can't
fallen
attempt
off.
to do another mobile computing platform that is at parity or under that of a dominant platform, right? If you're not offering anything different other than trying to offer Instagram wrapped in the Metro design language, that's not good enough for the end user. There's nothing there to get people that's pulling people into the platform, right?
Right.
You have to capture people's imaginations. You have to create experiences that ignite them that don't exist elsewhere, right? And that will only happen on an open platform,
Right.
And it's going to take time to get there. Don't get me wrong; it's not going to happen overnight. And
I mean, I think another way to think about it is like those ones that we mentioned, BlackBerry, Nokia, et cetera. They are inherently hardware companies, and they spent most of their resources and most of their time building great hardware. And sure, they had an operating system on top of it, and whether it was Nokia and Symbian and BlackBerry with their fairly kind of basic operating system that they've had, but they weren't. That was not where their core was. The core is shifting. The core is shifting now because people realize that there can be much faster and more interesting innovation, to Kurt's point,
right,
using software versus the actual hardware. And I think it has to take a software company to push that third mobile.
And not
OS.
only a software company to push it, a company that's focused on that, right?
So I think maybe having a counterpoint here could be interesting, right? So where yes, the idea of a third mobile OS is about open ecosystem. It's about open apps. It's about software developers being able to innovate and create a lot of value and choice and freedom for users to have the experiences that they want. But it almost reminds me of maybe 10 years ago when I bought a laptop and I opened it up and I saw all the business development partnerships preloaded and pre-installed on the desktop, right? And so I think one wonders, can all of these services and all these apps from all these disparate companies for a particular geography, as you mentioned, let's say Bulgaria has a particular set of apps that really work well there. Is that actually going to work well together, tied together?
Yeah. So again, this is not, bloatware 3.0, right? It's our belief that if you look at the app world, I would say probably less than 200 applications account for 75 to 80% of all global mobile data usage. And going beyond games, et cetera, a lot of these things are core services. Core services are things that I think people use multiple times during the course of the day, whether it's music and media, social, messaging, whatever it may be, et cetera. I believe that all of these things core services should fade to black. You should be able to use them. They should just come into use when you require these kind of things, right? So I think the identification over time, as we look forward over the next 10 to 15 years, the identification of a brand will come more from a set of experiences you get from that brand and a billing relationship you have with that brand. But the sort of the branded nature and the user experience and design language that everybody attempts to manifest through their own applications, some of this stuff is just going to become invisible, because I'd like to think that these core services need to be invisible. Computing needs to get out of the way. Computing going forward will become more transparent, right? And this is what I think an open platform enables. It enables the transparency of core services, right? Technology begins to disappear.
So you're just doing, and whether that's with your handset
right.
or your wearable or whatever,
right.
It just is a part of how you do things.
Right, it's parsing. So it's not like you're selecting certain things from settings, et cetera. These things are just happening. When you set your device up, you might make a certain a selection of defaults based upon what you use, right? I might use a certain music service. I might use a certain messenger. I might use a certain messenger and a certain geo. These are all defaults. And when in those frameworks and space-time constraints, these things begin to activate and manifest spontaneously based on the location, environment, experience that you're having, right?
Yeah.
Well, Kurt, we'll talk more about this, and thanks very much. And Zal, thanks for joining.
Yep, thank you.
Thanks.